Hello, hello. Today we're looking at natural selection in IB biology. This is a very, very important video because this is one of the few concepts that, whether you decide to do biology in the future or something completely unrelated, is fundamental to understand basically everything. So let's dive deep. I really want you to come and understand the concept, okay? Even if you don't remember the nitty-gritty, remember the main concept. So, what is natural selection as a whole? Okay, what you have to understand is where we start here. We start with one truth, okay, one simple truth. Organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. This has happened throughout millions of years, okay? Organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. That leads to competition. We call that intraspecific competition, right, within the same species, because there are limited resources like food, space, water, and light. So only some of them can survive. Those that survive are not chosen at random. So within any population, the individuals differ, right? There's variation. That's very important. So some are better adapted to the environment than others. These differences, remember, this variation arises through mutation, which is the one that creates new alleles, and sexual reproduction, which creates new combinations of alleles through both meiosis and fertilization. This genetic diversity is what provides the raw material for natural selection to act on. So individuals with traits that offer a survival or reproductive advantage, those are known as advantageous adaptations, are more likely to survive and to reproduce. So these are said to have higher fitness, okay? So survival of the fittest. And these traits get inherited more often, so over time, these traits become more common in the population. That is evolutionary change. Very importantly, okay, it's variation in the heritable traits, so only heritable traits can contribute to evolutionary change. So things that you acquired during your life, such as injuries or environmentally induced changes in gene expression, that is not encoded in the DNA, so it cannot be inherited. All right? Good. So now we're going to look more specifically at selection pressures, which they're very easy to understand, okay? So selection pressures are basically what determine which traits enhance survival and reproduction in a given environment, because it is not the same for an organism to live in the North Pole as it is to live in Morocco, for example. So the selective pressures are going to be very different in different environments. These pressures can be biotic, like competition for food, right? But they can also be abiotic, such as temperature extremes, the example I gave, or drought. So abiotic factors are normally density independent. What does that mean? It basically affects survival regardless of how many individuals are present. Because again, temperature extremes, it doesn't matter how many people are in the population, right? Or animals, it'll affect all of them the same. Whereas biotic factors normally are density dependent because they intensify. For example, competition for food. The more organisms there are in a population, the more the competition is for the available food. I think that's pretty straightforward. And then sexual selection is a very, very powerful pressure. So traits that improve an individual's success in attracting mates are favored, even if they reduce survival. Okay, that's very, very important because they allow you to pass on your genes to another generation. So there will be adaptations in this regard as well. Let's look specifically at the difference between sexual selection and then abiotic or biotic factors. So there's this guy, John Endler, who did these experiments with guppies, okay? These are guppies. And it demonstrated how both sexual and natural selection shape traits, okay? So when there was no predation, so they were put in a tank, I assume, with no predators, male guppies evolved these super bright colors. Why? Because the females preferred them, right? So it was a sexual selection advantageous trait. However, when you put them in habitats with predators, they evolved into much duller colors, right, to avoid detection. This was important because there were a lot of predators. So this just shows how over generations, selective pressures can alter allele frequencies, right, both due to natural and sexual selection. All right, moving on to HL. Thankfully, it's not much harder this time around. So first, looking at the gene pool, this is the same thing we've been looking at, okay? A gene pool is all of the genes and their alleles in a population, yeah? So Individuals contribute to the gene pool through reproduction, and those with advantageous traits contribute even more, right? The fitness, the natural selection. Then in geographically isolated populations, okay, there will be different selective pressures. As I just mentioned, animals that live in the North Pole are exposed to different pressures as animals that live in Morocco or China or the US, right? So because there are different selective pressures, the allele frequencies will slowly start to diverge, right? Meaning the traits that are advantageous in each will diverge, and therefore the alleles in those organisms will change. Again, if this happens on heritable genes, this is how evolution occurs, right? Gradual changes in the gene pool driven by differential reproductive success. Again, the same concept we've looked at, don't get too confused by this, but just theorized in a slightly different way through the gene pool, right? How this gene pool, this combination of alleles, changes over time. Okay. It can change in many ways because natural selection doesn't always act in the same way, right? Selective pressures. This is kind of the types of selective pressures that there can be. You can think of it that way. So stabilizing selection found here favors the average, right? For example, human babies. Human babies with very low or high birth weights have higher mortality. So the average weights are the best. Then we have disruptive over here. So you favor both extremes at the expense of the average. So when there's some types of salmon where small males and large males have breeding advantages, but the medium-sized males do very poorly. And then directional selection, favors one extreme. So it shifts the population's traits over time. An example is mice on an island called Go, which have evolved larger body sizes because they survive better. So regardless, all three result in changes in allele frequency and drive evolution. They just do so in different ways. Okay, this is the concept in this topic which confuses people the most. So let me try and make it very simple because it is not hard, okay? The Hardy-Weinberg equation. The Hardy-Weinberg equation is a very, very, very simplified model of how allele frequencies behave. I say it's very simple because it's in a population where there's no evolution, which obviously is not the case in real life. So this is just theoretical. But it makes sense. I don't know, it'll make sense once I explain it. So first we're going to assume that a gene has two alleles, only two versions of the gene, P and Q. So the allele frequencies are P plus Q equals 1, of course, right? Because there's only two alleles, so they total up to 1. This is basic probability. You've definitely done this in math. And then we have the genotype frequencies, okay? So the genotype, remember, is both of the alleles that you have. So in this case, the only three possibilities are that you're homozygous for P, in which case you have P times P, right? You have the probability of having P once times the probability of having P again, so P squared. Then you have the heterozygous, which is the probability of having P and then Q, so P times Q, but 2 times because you can have them in any given order. It's P and Q or Q and P, okay? That's why it's 2PQ. Or you can be homozygous for a Q, and again, that's Q squared. So all of these genotypes together, again, make 1, right, in terms of probabilities, because 1 is the total, and these are all the possible combinations. So you can use this to figure out different numbers. So for example, if they tell you that 1 in 20,000 people has a recessive condition, such as albinism, okay? Remember, if they have a recessive condition, that means they're homozygous for the recessive allele. Let's say, in this case, that's P. Then we know that P squared is 1 over 20,000, whatever that is, right? So you can then use that to calculate all the other numbers and determine the number of heterozygotes or dominant homozygotes, okay? But again, this is kind of BS because it assumes that there's no mutation, there's no natural selection, there's no migration, there's no random mating, and there's a large population size, which obviously is not the case ever, basically, because evolution does occur. But just so you understand the concept. And last thing is artificial selection, which is when humans deliberately breed organisms to have desirable traits for us, right? Not for the environment, for us. So this has shaped the development of things like dogs, right? Of chickens, of crops, etc. Bear in mind, artificial selection can drive very, very rapid evolutionary change, but it's not the same as natural selection because it's human-directed, it's intentional, right? Whereas natural selection, as I said, is driven by environmental pressures. And there are some unintended outcomes of human activity, such as antibiotic resistance in bacteria, right? But that is still natural selection because it hasn't occurred with deliberate human intent. So anything with deliberate human intent that causes evolution very, very quickly is artificial selection. Okay, let's do some questions. So, which of the following is the first step in natural selection? Again, I'll pause now in 3. Well, I won't pause. You can pause, and I'll count down from 3. So 3, 2, and 1. This is what we started with, right? Overproduction of offspring. If there's no overproduction, all of them can live in peace and quiet, and there's no need for there to be competition or anything. So, you first need to have too many offspring for the environment. Okay. The next one, a population of moths shows variation in wing color ranging from light gray to dark black. During industrialization, soot darkens tree bark, making dark moths less visible to predators. What will most likely occur over generations? Again, 3, 2, and 1. The frequency of the dark allele will increase, of course, because it protects it against predation, okay? Some of you might have thought new alleles for darker wings will arise due to predation. That is not true, okay? Environmental factors, and this is a very important concept, environmental factors do not trigger mutation in a specific direction, okay? So, this happening, this darkening of trees, doesn't cause moths to develop new mutations. The mutations just happen randomly in all sorts of directions and ways, and then some of them are favored over others. That is very, very important to remember, and a mistake I see IB students make all the time. So that's what I'd say. Okay? And then lastly, which condition is necessary for natural selection to occur? Again, 3, 2, and 1. Inheritance of variation through genes, right? Otherwise, you don't pass anything off to offspring, so there's no natural selection, and the rest are the opposite of what is necessary for a natural selection. You need exactly the opposite. Okay, any questions? I think this is straightforward-ish, but any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to answer. And in the meantime, good luck with studying. I'll see you next week.